You won't believe what happened when a corrupt homeowners association picked the wrong veteran to mess with. I'm Tom Bradley, and after 22 years serving in the Army Rangers, all I wanted was a quiet place to retire with my wife Lisa. What we got instead was a neighborhood ruled by tyrants who had no idea they were about to face someone trained in strategy, patience, and precision warfare. It started innocently enough. Lisa had always dreamed of having a small garden where she could grow vegetables and herbs. As a retired school nurse, she believed in the healing power of fresh, homegrown produce. Our new house in Maple Ridge Estates had the perfect sunny spot in the backyard, and within a month of moving in, she had transformed it into a beautiful raised bed garden. That's when we met Patricia Winters, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. Patricia was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair that never seemed out of place and a smile that never reached her eyes. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had never been told no, and she approached our front door with the confidence of a general inspecting troops. "Mr. Bradley," she said, consulting her tablet with theatrical precision, "your wife's garden installation violates Section 15 of the Maple Ridge Covenants. All landscaping modifications require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Board. You have 48 hours to remove it, or face a $500 fine." I remember standing there, processing her words with the same measured calm I had developed during countless high-pressure situations overseas. Lisa had researched the rules carefully before planting. The covenants mentioned front yard landscaping restrictions but said nothing specific about backyard gardens. This felt like selective enforcement, and in my experience, selective enforcement usually meant someone was abusing their authority. "I'd like to see where that's written," I said politely. We read through the covenants pretty carefully before Lisa started planting. Patricia's smile tightened. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Bradley. I don't have time to educate every new resident about proper community standards." She handed me a violation notice printed on official-looking letterhead. "Removal or payment. Those are your options." After she left, Lisa and I sat at our kitchen table, spreading out all the paperwork we had received when we bought the house. The covenants were 37 pages of dense legal language, but nowhere could we find the specific rule Patricia had cited. What we did find were several vague clauses about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics and property values, the kind of language that could be interpreted however someone in power chose to interpret it. "This reminds me of some of the corrupt local officials we dealt with overseas," I told Lisa. "They create rules that are deliberately vague so they can enforce them selectively against people they don't like or want to control." Lisa, who had dealt with difficult administrators throughout her nursing career, nodded grimly. "So what do we do? Fight it or just comply to keep the peace?" I looked out our back window at her beautiful garden, already showing the first green shoots of tomatoes and peppers. "We fight, but we fight smart. If there's one thing the Army taught me, it's that preparation and intelligence gathering win more battles than raw aggression." The next morning, I began what I privately called Operation Garden Defense. I walked through the neighborhood with a camera, documenting every single landscaping choice I could find. Patricia's own house featured an elaborate front yard fountain that was definitely not standard construction. 3 houses down, someone had installed decorative stone borders around their flower beds. The house across the street had a small greenhouse visible from the road. None of these modifications appeared to have been removed or fined, which meant either they had all received proper approval or the rules were being enforced selectively. In military intelligence, we called this pattern recognition, and the pattern here was becoming clear. I also made a point of introducing myself to neighbors during my walks. Most were friendly but seemed nervous when I mentioned the HOA. An elderly man named Frank whispered that Patricia had forced 2 families to move out in the past year over increasingly ridiculous violations. A young mother named Jennifer mentioned that she had wanted to install a swing set for her children, but was afraid to even ask for approval. "She makes people feel like they're living under surveillance," Jennifer confided. "My husband says we should just keep our heads down and follow whatever rules she makes up, but it doesn't feel right." By the end of the week, I had documented 15 clear violations of the stated covenants that had apparently never been cited, while simultaneously identifying several families who felt intimidated by Patricia's management style. This wasn't just about my wife's garden anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse that was affecting the entire community. I requested a formal hearing with the HOA board to contest our violation. The meeting was held in the community center, a building that Patricia had clearly decorated to intimidate rather than welcome. The conference table was positioned on a raised platform, with Patricia sitting in the center like a judge presiding over a trial. 4 other board members flanked her, but it quickly became apparent that they were essentially rubber stamps for her decisions. When I presented my evidence that similar landscaping existed throughout the neighborhood without violations, Patricia dismissed it with a wave of her hand. Those installations were grandfathered in or received proper approval, she said without consulting any files or documentation. Your garden was installed without permission and must be removed. I had expected this response. In military operations, you always plan for the enemy to take the most aggressive position possible. I'd like to see the documentation showing which installations received approval and when, I said calmly. As homeowners, we have the right to review association records. Patricia's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment. That information is confidential board business. Actually, I replied, pulling out printed copies of state laws governing homeowners associations. Association records are required to be available for member review under State Statute 47-113. I'm formally requesting access to all architectural approval records for the past 3 years. The other board members looked uncomfortable. One of them, a nervous man named David, cleared his throat. Patricia, shouldn't we check with our attorney about this? Patricia shot him a look that could have frozen fire. The board will consider Mr. Bradley's request and respond in due course. This hearing is concluded. As we filed out, I noticed David lingering behind. He approached me in the parking lot, looking around nervously as if afraid someone might see him talking to me. Mr. Bradley, he said quietly, I think you should know that Patricia doesn't keep detailed approval records. Most of the decisions are made arbitrarily, and she just tells us what to vote for. I've been uncomfortable with it for a while, but she controls the board completely. This was the intelligence breakthrough I had been hoping for. Patricia's system relied on intimidation and the assumption that homeowners would comply rather than fight back. But she had no documentation to support her arbitrary enforcement because there was no legitimate system behind it. Over the following weeks, Patricia escalated the conflict in predictable ways. She issued additional violations for minor infractions that had never been enforced before. Our mailbox was apparently 2 inches too far from the curb. Our lawn was supposedly uneven in one small section. And Lisa's herb pots on our back patio were deemed an aesthetic violation visible from other properties. Each new citation came with increasing fines and threatening language about property lanes. It was psychological warfare designed to exhaust our resources and break our will to resist. But Patricia had made a critical error in judgment. She was using intimidation tactics against someone who had been trained to recognize and counter exactly these kinds of pressure campaigns. I expanded my intelligence gathering to include Patricia herself. Public records showed that she had moved to Maple Ridge 5 years ago after retiring from a mid-level management position at an insurance company. More interestingly, the HOA's financial records, which were supposed to be public, were nearly impossible to obtain and filled with vague expense categories when I finally got copies. The association collected substantial monthly fees from residents, but the money seemed to disappear into administrative costs, consulting fees, and maintenance contracts that were never clearly specified. Either Patricia was incompetent at managing finances, or money was being diverted for purposes not directly related to community maintenance. Lisa, meanwhile, had been conducting her own research among the neighbors. Her nursing background had taught her to ask the right questions and listen carefully to what people weren't saying directly. She discovered that Patricia had been systematically targeting families with children, elderly residents, and anyone who asked questions about board decisions. It's like she's trying to create a community of people who won't challenge her authority, Lisa explained over dinner. She wants compliant residents who will pay their fees and follow orders without asking questions. The breaking point came when Patricia issued a violation notice against Frank, the elderly gentleman I had met during my neighborhood walks. His crime was having a small ramp installed at his front door to accommodate his mobility scooter. The ramp was clearly a medical necessity, and targeting disabled residents crossed a line that even some of Patricia's supporters found uncomfortable. I decided it was time to escalate to phase 2 of my operation. Building a coalition of affected residents and documenting the pattern of abuse for formal complaints to state authorities. I organized the first informal neighborhood meeting at our house, inviting everyone who had expressed concerns about HOA management. 12 families attended, sharing stories that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and financial mismanagement. Jennifer, the mother who had been afraid to install a swing set, broke down crying as she described how Patricia had made her feel like a criminal for wanting to create a play area for her children. Frank explained that the ramp violation could force him to sell his home since he couldn't navigate the front steps without assistance. By the end of the evening, we had formed what I dubbed the Maple Ridge Residents Coalition. Our goals were simple: document all instances of selective enforcement, demand transparency in HOA financial management, and work toward replacing Patricia's board with representatives who would serve the community rather than their own power. Interests. I created a secure online forum where residents could anonymously share their experiences and coordinate our documentation efforts. Within days, we had collected evidence of over 30 instances where similar violations had been enforced inconsistently, along with testimony from residents who had been harassed, threatened, or driven out of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, I filed formal complaints with the state agency responsible for overseeing homeowners associations. The complaints detailed the selective enforcement patterns, the lack of financial transparency, and the targeting of vulnerable residents like Frank. I also contacted a local investigative reporter who had written about HOA abuse in other communities. Patricia's response was swift and predictable. She called an emergency board meeting to address what she termed disruptive activities by certain residents who are undermining community harmony. She proposed new rules restricting residents' ability to communicate with each other about association business, and threatened legal action against anyone spreading what she called false information about board operations. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening with less than the required notice period, violating the association's own bylaws, but it gave me the opportunity to see Patricia when she felt cornered and reactive, rather than in complete control. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge I hadn't heard before, "your military background might have taught you to treat everything like a battle. But this is a residential community with rules and standards. If you can't adapt to civilized neighborhood living, perhaps Maple Ridge isn't the right fit for your family." I stood up slowly, letting the room fall silent before responding. "Ma'am, my military background taught me to recognize corruption, abuse of authority, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable people. It also taught me that when someone refuses to provide documentation for their decisions and threatens residents for asking questions, they usually have something to hide." I pulled out a folder containing all the evidence our coalition had gathered. These are documented instances of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, and harassment of elderly and disabled residents. I'm not treating this like a battle. I'm treating it like what it is: a responsibility to protect my community from someone who has forgotten that they work for the residents, not the other way around. The room erupted in discussion, with several residents voicing support for investigating Patricia's management. For the first time since we had moved to Maple Ridge, I saw Patricia look genuinely worried. The next phase of our campaign focused on legal and regulatory pressure. The state investigation had found merit in our complaints and launched a formal audit of the association's financial records and governance practices. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about HOA abuse, featuring Frank's story and the broader pattern of harassment affecting multiple families. Most importantly, we had identified enough concerned residents to force a special election for new board members. Under state law, if 25% of homeowners petitioned for new elections, the current board could be replaced. We had collected signatures from over 40% of residents, showing just how widespread the dissatisfaction had become. Patricia made one final desperate attempt to maintain control by hiring an attorney and threatening to sue individual residents for defamation. But her lawyer quickly realized that everything we had documented was factually accurate and legally protected as legitimate complaints about governance issues. The election was held on a Saturday morning in the community center. Patricia had controlled that space for so long that holding a democratic process there felt like a symbolic victory in itself. The turnout was unprecedented, with families who had never attended association meetings showing up to vote for change. When the results were announced, Patricia's entire slate had been defeated. The new board included Frank, despite his age, David, who had finally found the courage to openly oppose Patricia's methods, and Jennifer, the young mother who had been afraid to install a playground for her children. Patricia's departure was swift and ungraceful. She submitted her resignation via email, making vague threats about legal action that never materialized. The financial audit revealed thousands of dollars in questionable expenses, but Patricia had been careful to stay just within the boundaries of legal, if unethical, behavior. The transformation of Maple Ridge was immediate and dramatic. The new board's first action was to rescind all pending violations and establish clear, consistently applied standards for architectural modifications. Frank's mobility ramp was officially approved retroactively, along with several other accessibility modifications that had been unfairly targeted. Lisa's garden became a model for other residents who had been afraid to pursue their own landscaping dreams. Within 6 months, the neighborhood was dotted with vegetable gardens, children's play areas, and personalized touches that reflected the diversity and creativity of the families who actually lived there. The financial savings from eliminating Patricia's questionable expenses allowed the association to reduce monthly fees, while actually improving community services. We organized neighborhood barbecues, established a tool-sharing program, and created a community garden where residents could collaborate on larger growing projects. As I reflect on the experience now, 2 years later, I realize that the skills I developed during my military service translated perfectly to civilian leadership challenges. The same strategic thinking, patience, and commitment to protecting others that served me overseas were exactly what our community needed to overcome a different kind of threat. The most satisfying moment came during our first anniversary celebration of the new board. Frank, now serving as treasurer, stood up to address the gathered residents. "A lot of people talk about supporting our veterans," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "But Tom Bradley showed us what that support looks like in action. He didn't just serve our country overseas. He served our neighborhood right here at home, teaching all of us that we don't have to accept corruption or abuse from anyone, no matter what kind of authority they claim to have." Lisa squeezed my hand as the crowd applauded. "You know," she whispered, "this wasn't the quiet retirement we planned, but I think it might be exactly what we needed." I looked around at the faces of neighbors who had transformed from frightened, isolated residents into a genuine community of people who looked out for each other. Children played freely in yards that had once been restricted by arbitrary rules. Elderly residents received help with heavy lifting and transportation. Young families felt supported rather than surveilled. "Sometimes," I replied, "the most important battles are the ones that find you when you're not looking for a fight. But when they do, you have to be ready to stand up for what's right, no matter how comfortable it would be to just keep your head down and comply." The reporter who had covered our story returned a year later to write a follow-up piece about the long-term effects of our successful campaign against HOA abuse. She asked me what advice I would give to other residents facing similar situations in their own communities. "Document everything," I told her. "Build coalitions with other affected residents. Use legal channels and regulatory oversight. Most importantly, Remember that bullies rely on isolation and intimidation. When communities come together and refuse to be divided, corruption can't survive. The story of Maple Ridge became a case study that other communities used to address their own HOA problems. Lisa and I received letters from residents across the country who had successfully challenged abusive board members using strategies similar to what we had developed. But the real victory wasn't defeating Patricia or changing the board composition. It was creating a community where people felt empowered to speak up when something wasn't right, where transparency replaced secrecy, and where leadership served residents rather than personal power interests. Today, Maple Ridge Estates is exactly what we hoped to find when we first moved here. A peaceful neighborhood where people know their neighbors, children play safely, and adults treat each other with respect and dignity. Lisa's garden has expanded into a community demonstration plot where she teaches other residents about sustainable growing practices. As for me, I've discovered that retirement doesn't mean the end of service. It just means finding new ways to use the skills and experience you've developed to make your immediate community a better place. Whether that's overseas or in your own backyard, the principles of leadership, integrity, and protecting those who can't protect themselves remain exactly the same. The trellis Lisa and I built together still stands in our backyard, now covered, with flowering vines that attract butterflies and hummingbirds. Every time I see it, I remember that some fights choose you, and when they do, the only question is whether you'll face them with courage or bow to intimidation. In this case, courage won, and our entire community is stronger because we chose to stand up rather than stand down. That's a victory worth fighting for, and a lesson worth sharing with anyone facing similar challenges in their own neighborhood.